So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, it's my great pleasure today to have Professor Štěpánka Zemanová with us to speak about non-state sanctions against Russia, senders, targeting, effectiveness, and ethics. I circulated and we published a bio of Professor Zemanová, but I may quickly present her anyway. You are the head of the Department of International Diplomatic Studies of the Faculty of International Relations at the University of Economics, Prague. It's a place that I know because you used to be my colleague there, and after you were my boss. And in your professional work, you specialized in norms in international relations. And this will be our topic today, the particular question of the non-state sanctions. And one of your favorite topics or topic of specialization are human rights, and another one are small state politics, or both together. You are publishing a lot, you are as well advisor or the member of a different board of advising to the Czech government. You are in the editorial board of different journals like the Czech Journal of International Relations, and now you participated to create a new section of the International Study Association called the Global International Relations section. Years, and you became a member of this executive committee. Congratulations for this. Štěpánka, Professor Zemanová, thanks again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. And actually, I decided for a topic which is quite up to date. At the first sight, it might seem not to be related to my research agenda, but it is, because it is related also to the protection of international norms and especially the core norms, which are, we could say, the core of the current international law. And at the same time, it is related to maybe my third research agenda, which is economic relations, and in particular international sanctions as a part of economic relations, interstate economic relations. I said that it's quite a new topic, but at the same time, it's one of the very old topics, or one of the very old parts of the international politics, because the international sanctions as a kind of coercion tools used in international politics have a very long history, and actually its roots, or their roots, go back to the ancient world, and they are usually traced back up to the Megara Decree, which was adopted in the 5th century before Christ. But the modern development of international sanctions started in the 20th century, and it is connected with the history of the League of Nations first, and later with the United Nations, of course. So far, international sanctions tools have been used primarily by the intergovernmental organizations such as the League of Nations or the United Nations, also by the regional organizations such as the European Union in our region or in our case, but also the African Union or the League of Arabic States are the sanction centers. And it is also a tool that's used also by states. Both the intergovernmental organizations and states use sanctions for various reasons. They use them to coerce states or other entities that are breaking international law. They are breaking particular norms of international law. Sanctions are very often used in the relation to the interstate war or also the intrastate war, just to constrain the parties involved into the conflict, for example, to constrain their power by stopping the inflow of weapons to the region or by damaging them economically. But sometimes sanctions are also used just to signal something to the international community, to signal a kind of disagreement with what the target of the sanctions is doing, the disagreement with breaching the international norms, with the behavior of the target. Of course, international sanctions are one of the tools that have been used in the connection with the situation in Ukraine, and they have been used since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea. For example, the European Union is now preparing the 10th round of these sanctions. They have already imposed and changed their sanctions portfolio for 9 times, and now the 10th step or the 10th package of sanctions is being prepared. But what's new from the February, this year's February, from the outbreak of war in Ukraine, is the involvement of non-state actors. And this is the topic of my today's lecture. What's important to stress is that the non-state actors' involvement is not appearing in the vacuum. It is, or these sanctions are adopted in a broader context of the interstate sanctions. The international sanctions politics has gone through several changes. The major change appeared at the turn of the millennium, and it was the change of the whole philosophy of the use of the international sanctions, which moved from a kind of using sanctions as an economic weapon to smart sanctions. What's the core of the change? Actually, the original idea was that the sanction senders, the states or the international organizations, who usually sanctioned a state, a perpetrator of violence, a party which initiated war, or a state who broke international norms in a serious way. The senders wanted to target the state indirectly through damaging or harming its population. So the sanctions were targeted in the first step to the population of the state, and there was the idea that the population would pressure the politicians, the regime, the representatives of the state to change the state's behavior. But in practice, actually, this idea or this logic did not work, or it brought many problems. In particular, the population was sometimes harmed very severely or very seriously. There were several humanitarian issues discussed in this connection, and at the same time, the politicians of the target states used the situation for their propaganda, and because most of the target regimes were not democratic, simply the idea that they would listen to the voice of the population did not work, and rather they manipulated the population to turn the public opinion against the sanction senders. The clear example is the sanctions that were imposed at the beginning of the 1990s on Iraq in the connection to the annexation of Kuwait. And the propaganda of Saddam Hussein, who used the suffering of the population to turn the public opinion against the sanction senders. So because of this civilian pain and the lack of working of this logic, there was a sanctions reform around 2000, around the year 2000, and the international community moved from the economic weapon to the so-called smart sanctions that target directly those who cause the breaches of norm, or who support them, or who profit from the breaches of the international law. So the idea is now to target directly the representatives of the regimes, the prominents who support the regime, or sometimes smart sanctions are used not only against states and their representatives, but also against the private unities, private actors, private individuals who, for example, commit the terrorist attacks and are related to non-state rebel groups, terrorist units, and so on. As I have already said, the non-state sanctions, or the non-state, the sanctions used by the non-state actors now are adopted in a broader context of the sanctions against Russia that have been created, or that have been in force already since 2014. These sanctions are not overwhelmed by the UN or by its Security Council. That's clear because of the Russian veto. But they have been introduced by a coalition of the like-minded, or sometimes also called allied states, which include mainly the European Union and the member states of the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Australia, Japan, and a few other states. Until recently, it was a standard sanctions regime imposed by the standard actors, the state actors. But this changed in February 2022 with the emergence of the first non-state actors sanctions measures. So actually, by the measures that have been imposed and implemented by the private entities or by the actors who belong to this broad group of non-state actors. Here in this picture, we can see the complexity of the situation and of the non-state sanctions measures. There are currently quite a broad group of sanctions senders, which includes companies, individuals, celebrities, epistemic communities, also several educational and research institutions. There are many other actors that pressure the main senders to adopt additional non-state sanctions measure or to join this movement. These include, of course, other non-state actors, but the government of Ukraine is also strongly pressuring on this, and there have been several calls or several appeals, even from Volodymyr Zelensky to in particular big companies to join this movement, and also embassies of Ukraine in various states are very active in the relation to non-state sanctions. And of course, there are the targets, which should be primarily the Russian regime, but in reality, the group of targets is much more broad or much broader, and it includes also many individuals, some of them easily to identify, but also many unidentified or unidentifiable ordinary people. Actually, the non-state sanctions are in many aspects similar to those that have been so far imposed by states and international organizations, but at the same time, there are several differences. The main differences insist in the process and in the legal aspects of the imposing and implementing the sanctions or the individual sanctions tool. The official sanctions, so the standard sanctions that are used by international intergovernmental organizations and state, are very formal. It is a strictly formalized process that has strict legal rules given by both by the international and domestic law, and also by European law in our region. The process is controlled, it should be transparent, and because of this, it is sometimes quite time consuming, so it always takes some time to decide about the sanctions and to impose the sanctions. Sometimes the period is longer, sometimes it's a bit shorter, but because of the strict rules, it usually needs some time. And at the same time, there has been developing a system of remedies, which is current or step-by-step improving. So, for example, if the sanctions are imposed on individuals, they are usually listed in special lists that are called sanctions list, but the individuals can appeal this and then they can request delisting, and several delisting procedures have been already developed. Even in the case of the economic weapon, so in the broad sanctions like trade boycotts or trade embargoes, there is a system of humanitarian exceptions, for example, on medicals or foods and so on. These are tools that have been developing for many years or for several decades. They have been improving. Maybe they don't work 100% well, but a lot has been done in this way. In contrast, the non-state sanctions are rather informal. Actually, it is a spontaneous process. It's an immediate response, which is quite creative, because actually any non-state actor can adopt a measure, any measure which is not prohibited by law. There are some borders given by both the international law and, in this case, in particular, the domestic legal systems of states. But at the same time, what's not prohibited is allowed, and in these borders or in these limits, the non-state actors can create practically any tool they are able to design somehow. Who are actually these non-state actors who have adopted the non-state sanctions so far? As you can see here, the range is quite broad. The main package of sanctions, of non-state sanctions, has been imposed by the business sector. This has been even monitored by both specialists and also less formally by projects like Wikipedia. I have included some links here. And the monitoring works better in the case of bigger companies, but also many small businesses have joined. As for the bigger companies, the lists at the moment include more than 1,000 of the companies. The current number is around 1,200. But mostly these are big visible companies from the Western world, and the small companies from countries like the Czech Republic or Poland are not that visible and that represented on the lists as those from, for example, the US or the UK, although there are many as well. At the same time, various international non-governmental organizations have joined this movement and also imposed their own non-state sanctions. The visible ones include, for example, the sports organizations that have been excluding Russian sportsmen from various international sports events. But there are also many less visible interest organizations, for example, the international feline organizations that's prohibiting the presence of Russian exhibitors on the international exhibitions and so on. The pictures here show also some celebrities that, for example, canceled their performances in Russia. These are not only musicians that are in the picture to the left, but also, for example, the famous writers who ceased their contracts or rejected to renew their contracts with Russian publishers. And with much more reluctance, also the educational research and research sector joined this movement, but here the sanctions are much more contested, and these institutions are not that eager to join as business or the international non-governmental organizations. more activity is visible in the cultural institutions like theaters and opera houses and so on. And the non-state actors imposing non-state sanctions had been joined even by many individuals, consumers who simply boycott Russian goods. Why do these actors join? There is a variety of motives at the moment. Of course, many of them join for principal issues because they want to signal the principal attitudes, because they simply want to express that what's happening is not good, that it's in breach with international law, and that Russia should be stopped in what it is doing. So the combination of principal motives and also signaling is quite often. At the same time, there is a group of non-state actors, for example, among businesses, but also among cultural institutions, who are joining for instrumental reasons. It can be reputational motives because they are criticized by other actors for continuing the relations and business in Russia, continuing relations with Russia. At the same time, the political and security risks at the Russian market have been growing, and the business relations have been also complicated by the sanctions of the like-minded states. So a lot of businesses are pressured to leave the market, or at least to downsize their operations in the market because of the situation, and they use the context of sanctions just to improve their reputation as well, because they are simply reasoning or presenting their steps they would do otherwise, or as actually the principal position, or as the sanctions. Yeah, and there are strong pressures, especially from the public, media, non-governmental organizations, and also by some epistemic communities, and to the Ukrainian government, as I have already said, in the form of naming and shaming. So the visible actors continuing their relations with Russia are exposed to the pressure and public shaming because of doing this. We can even see several lists of shame. Again, I have included a link to this, and you can see the example of a shaming post here. And actually, this is the example of a scaling of the pressure up to threats that are coming, for example, from the anonymous movement, who are threatening these companies with cyber attack or with counter actions in case they do not leave the Russian market. What exactly do we mean when speaking about the non-state sanctions, or what tools can be used as the non-state sanctions? The current situation or the experience in the past months show that the non-state actors are able to create almost every sanctions tools but diplomacy, or outside diplomacy. Diplomacy actually is the only area or the only issue that is the domain of international intergovernmental organizations or states, and where the non-state actors are not able to reach. But any other types of the relations of states, sporting relations, cultural relations, of course, economic relations, transportation, science cooperation, and so on, can be targeted and at least partially interrupted by the non-state actors. As I have said, the targets are usually individuals. They can be very concrete because many of these measures target prominents and supporters of the Putin's regime, or people who benefit from supporting the regime. These are the cases, for example, of Russian artists or Russian sportsmen. And I have one example here, the famous opera singer Anna Netrebko, who is one of the targets of these sanctions. Of course, the support of the regime or the profit from the good ties from the regimes are one of the reasonings or the main reasoning of the sanctions. And it is the same reasoning as used by the targeted sanctions at the interstate level. But what's different from this targeted or smart sanctions used traditionally by states are the remedies, because the interstate sanctions enable these remedies procedures as delisting, as I have already said. But in these cases, it is rather complicated. It's not impossible. The people can contest the steps of the sanction senders, for example, by national courts in the countries where the cancellations, for example, of their performances or of their appearances in sport events appear, or for example in these sports sanctions, the sportsman can also use various mechanisms in the international sporting organizations. But in some cases it is quite time consuming, it's expensive, and it's rather complicated, so it's more difficult than in the case of interstate sanctions. At the same time, the sanctions, the non-state sanctions, target unknown individuals, for example, the consumers of goods of companies that are withdrawing from the Russian market. And in this case, the system of remedies does not work. And at the same time, unlike the interstate sanctions, there are no humanitarian exceptions that would be adopted, or they are not part of this process. Sometimes the companies play this card, such the big food companies, Nestle and so on, and use it as the reasoning for continuing business with some goods, in particular with foods, medicals, and so on. But the question is if it's the right reasoning, or if it's an excuse for continuing doing business in Russia. It's a subject of the debate, and maybe we can get to this a bit later. And the question is now, what are the consequences of the adoption of non-state sanctions? What is the effectiveness, and also what are the ethical lessons learned from this process? One of the consequences for the future could be a development of a new engagement or actorness of the non-state actors. The question is if it's just a contemporary phenomenon related to this particular conflict, or if it continues, if it will be repeated in the future. So it is difficult to say at the moment whether it's durable and whether the process is sustainable, but maybe it is a new emerging tool that will be used repeatedly. In a certain sense, it can be the return to the non-selective economic weapon, in particular in the cases of sanctions that are directed to the unknown individuals, to the consumers, or to the general public, to the whole population. At the same time, this weapon works a bit differently than it used to work several decades ago in the cases like Iraq or Haiti and so on, because Russia is much more developed economically in comparison to these countries. The economic situation of the population is better, and because of the progress during these decades that have passed from the last use of the economic weapon by the UN, there have been new goods and new services, and the cuts of these new services and new goods can constrain the consumers severely, but at the same time not fatally. So they are not using these humanitarian problems. What I mean, many sanctions, actually business sanctions, actually appear in the virtual world, in services like streaming TV programs or computer games and so on. So the humanitarian consequences of the end of the services like Netflix broadcasting or streaming some computer games are almost zero in comparison to those of boycott of goods. But at the same time, a part of these sanctions still can be targeted on foods, hygiene, medicines, and so on. So this is the question: how to differentiate, or what to do with this. And the third question is effectiveness, which is always a very tricky question in case of the sanctions, because even the effectiveness of interstate sanctions have been discussed very broadly, and it is quite a complicated issue, because the sanctions usually work in a long time, or in a long period, but their short-time effects are usually not that visible and that that quick. Yeah. So it can be said, or it is reported, that the sanctions cause some damage to the Russian economy, but it is difficult to divide what damage has been caused by the war itself by the interstate sanctions and by the non-state sanctions, and also by the previous situation, the COVID-19 pandemic, and so on and so on. At the same time, for example, the business sanctions has been replaced by the informal imports, so the imports actually from countries that do not impose these sanctions, and these imports are actually imports the businesses that have withdrawn from Russia do not control. So as you can see here in the pictures, the Russian economy has been hit by the situation, but the question is what part of it are the non-state actions, the non-state sanctions. And if we took the non-state sanctions as the economic weapon and expected that there is the philosophy of pressuring public to change their attitudes to war and to pressure the regime to stop its behavior or to change its behavior, the question is whether it really works. We do little about the public meaning or public attitudes in Russia because of the opinion polls are quite problematic for various reasons. Some media report that the attitudes have been slowly changing. But the question is how important would this change be for the regime? At the moment, it does not seem that the regime would, or that the public pressure would be that strong that it would really interest the regime, and rather the regime is using the situation for the propaganda. And as for the ethics, the ethic of non-state sanctions is starting to be a subject of a debate. There are various arguments, both in favor of against these sanctions, and I have tried to summarize the most important of them in this last slide of my presentation. So the proponents of non-state sanctions usually say that it's better to do something than doing nothing. So the sanctions are better than doing nothing. And in relation to the humanitarian consequences or possible humanitarian consequences, of course, the pain of the Ukrainian victims of war is worse than that of the people hit by the sanctions against Russia. The problem are sometimes the motives. As I have already said, a part of the non-state actions have been imposed for principal reasons, but at the same time, there are sanctions imposed for instrumental reasons. So ethical washing is a part of this movement. Also, I have mentioned the celebrity sanctions, and there are some celebrities, in particular among influencers, who are using their steps to create the content, attractive content of their Instagram posts and so on. So these are the problems in the motivation. Another ethical problem is the informal way of the imposition, following no rules. Actually, there are no requirements, legal requirements or ethical requirements on the imposition. As I have already said, there is the problem of the remedies. at the moment, there is the lack of selectiveness, in particular of the sanctions imposed by businesses. There is the lack of justice for people who disagree with war, because not all the people hit by the sanctions agree with war, support the war, and so on. As for the consumer boycotts, it also turns out that not everything which is considered to be Russian is really of the Russian origin. So sometimes the sanctions paradoxically target, or in particular the consumer boycotts paradoxically target goods that are not linked to Russia at all. Yeah, I have already spoken also about the humanitarian aspects. And what's also discussed is a kind of the cancellation culture. This is related in particular to the sanctions in the cultural that are directly directed against some people, as I have already as I have already mentioned, also against some Russian ensembles, performers, and so on. But at the same time, they are directed towards or against some traditional Russian pieces like ballet or theater plays and so on, very old, not related to this war at all. So should these be included to the sanctions or not? And last but not least, also the consequences in the sanctions in the consequences of the sanctions in education and science have been discussed. In particular, that many people in Russian epistemic communities or academia condemn the war. And at the same time, in many fields, the Russian science is quite important for making the progress or pacing the so-far trace of progress. So this is another important part of the debate. Of course, there are many controversies related to these aspects, many pros and cons related to the imposition of non-state sanctions, but this is the reality that will continue, at least in this case, and this is the reason why it is important and we should pay the attention for it. And that's all from my side at the moment, and we can start the discussion now. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can share now. Stop the share to share the PowerPoint to see each other better. It's this.
Trying to stop it. But it does not seem to.
Well,
but maybe I will.
Stop. I don't know how to stop this. Sharing.
Now should be
okay. I think it works.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for this this presentation. This presentation was not only concerning the question of the sanctions now in Russia, but it's a new domain now of reflection. And I will have millions of questions, but maybe many other people would like to have questions. So I invite you to ask directly question or to use the chat. To see, I just have a look. There are already questions on the chat. I can notice one at least. Other Frederica, maybe Frederica, are you able to ask directly the question, or do you prefer, maybe you have a problem with the microphone?
Can you listen to me?
Yes, we hear
Can you
you.
hear me? Okay. I'd like to know why, despite the sanctions and measures implemented against Russia from 2014 to nowadays to 2022, Russia continues to attack Ukraine. Also, and considering that all the sanctions and measures didn't stop Putin, what else could be done to stop Russia once and for all, if Russia will stop? Thank you.
Wow, this is a very ambitious question.
Indeed, it is. It's a tough question. And actually, if we knew, maybe we would have already advised to the politicians to use these steps. But if I go back to the question of international sanctions, and in particular, in this case, of the interstate sanctions, because the sanctions regime until the February 2022 was the interstate sanctions regime with the broader participation of the European Union as a specific entity. Actually, the sanctions started as a quite mild package of the diplomatic sanctions that was scaled step by step, and maybe not quickly enough. That's also the question. It is difficult to say what exactly the sanction senders followed, or what were their exact aim at the very beginning of this regime. Of course, they called for the observance of the international law, and for the Russian withdrawal from the Crimea at the very beginning. That was the official request. But at the same time, they must have known that this will be quite complicated, and that the sanctions won't be sufficient enough. So that signaling moment was also an important element of these sanctions, because most of these actors simply wanted to show, we do not agree with what is happening. We are calling you to withdraw or to change the behavior, but at the same time, we are not ready to do more, to pressure you to do so. And on the one hand, the sanctions have been scaled first to harm Russia or pressure Russia diplomatically, and then also to pressure several representatives, and, as I have said, also the prominence of the regime, and to pressure the strategic sectors, or to cause the economic harm through the constraints on the strategic sector, like the petroleum sector. But as you know, at the same time, the cooperation and economic ties with Russia continued. So it has not been done enough. But the question is if it was possible to develop that strong sanctions in the 2014 to solve the situation only with this tool, and maybe diplomatic negotiation, or with the combination of these tools. So actually, the answer is not easy, and the question is if such a combination of sanctions even exists that would make Russia to change their behavior, or if the pressure needs to be increased both politically and, of course, there is always the possibility of intervention as well, but that's very dangerous. And then something that the like-minded states, least at the moment, want to avoid, I think.
I noticed that we have two other questions on the chat. So Amelia Głowacka, three other questions. Amelia Głowacka, do you want to ask directly? If not, we can read the question. Good morning. Which non-state actors' sanctions have the biggest impact and are the most effective?
Again, at the moment, it is difficult to say because there are no studies in the effectiveness of these measures, and it is difficult to isolate the effect. But in my opinion, at the moment, those sanctions that are most visible for the Russian population would be the most effective, or at least would be those just bringing the population to follow this, to follow the developments and to think about it critically and maybe change their minds, because there are many sanctions that are less visible. Even we do not know about all the steps the actors, the non-state actors have done. Although I have said that there are these monitoring exercises, they do not include comprehensive lists. In particular, small entities are not included. They are sometimes reported by the media. Sometimes maybe you notice them if you visit some restaurant not serving Russian food and so on and so on. You can notice it, but this is not included in the lists, and this won't be noticed by the Russian public as well. So maybe those most visible could work the most, but at the same time, they are also those which can be most easily used by the propaganda, and they have been already used. So, which then, of course, reduces.
So we have many questions. There is two questions from Paulina. I'm not sure to understand them totally. So maybe if Paulina is there, there is no name. It's just Paulina. I invite you to ask directly. If not, I can read the question. I hear nothing, so I'm reading the question. First question, can sanctions lead Russia to closer cooperation with other isolated states? Is it about North Korea? But there was already. And
of
second
course.
question, is it probable that the non-state sanction will be used in the future?
Yeah. As for the first question, I think this is already happening. And when the sanctions continue longer, it will be more and more the case, because Russia has already lost many partners, many business partners in the West. And what are they doing? They are trying to replace their supplies, their goods, and their services by those from other countries, in particular, for example, from China, but also several others. And at the same time, it can boost also domestic production of some goods. So these goods and services that are currently the subject to both interstate sanctions and the non-state sanctions will be sooner or later replaced somehow, either by the domestic entrepreneurs or by the imports. And actually, I maybe will then send the presentation to Mr. Maslovsky, if you can share it with our audience. But if you remember these two graphs I showed you, which captured the developments of Russian economy. One of them was the development of imports, and it could be seen there that the imports have declined until recently, but they have already reached the bottom, and now they are starting to grow again. And this might be because of this replacement of the Western goods and services by those from other countries. At the same time, maybe you have noticed that recently Russia has strengthened its cooperation with Iran, and the UN has already also adopted some sanctions towards Iran. So this is another example. It's not only the reason of the sanctions, but it's the reason of the whole situation. Yeah, and the probability that non-state sanctions will be used in the future, that's the question. It's something which is new, but at the same time, we will see how it works. Maybe it, I would say that it will depend on the long-term effect of these sanctions. What I maybe forgot to say is that to a large extent, these sanctions are boosted by the new media, because there are very strong pressures on the companies and also, for example, the sports international organizations, non-state organizations, and so on, through the new media, social networks, like Twitter, Facebook. In particular, Twitter has been used very intensively for this. And if these sanctions work in the long term, at least a bit, I think this might repeat in the future.
So we have a lot of questions. Shugo Kikuchi, if I'm pronouncing well, is asking, or maybe you want to ask directly? If not, I'm reading. Which country should lead sanctions against Russia? So I'm not sure if we are speaking about non-state actors.
If we first, maybe if we speak about the traditional interstate sanctions, at the moment there is the coalition of the countries. Maybe the most active and visible players in these coalitions are the United States of America, of course, and at the same time the European Union. And in the European Union, the sanctions activity is usually led both by the representatives of the EU and at the same time by the presidency. So at the moment, the Czech presidency, the current Czech presidency, is very active in this regard. But these are sovereign countries, and rather they cooperate. I mean, the coalition of the countries that has sent the sanctions are sovereign countries that cooperate. There can be an informal leader, but there is no official leadership, of course, because it's no institution, it's international cooperation. So the USA and the EU are setting the trends, but at the same time, the extent to which they join and the tools that will be adopted and implemented are always the sovereign decision of other states that join the coalition.
Thank you. Federica Cautero, do you think that entering the EU could be a way to ensure safety and protection for Ukraine? We can take more questions together, but
yeah, it's also very difficult question. Of course, joining the EU is, although EU is not a security organization, but it has, of course, the security cooperation or political cooperation as well. But entering the EU is related to, or has its security aspects. But at the same time, it is not the decision of the state. It is a complicated and long process, and it is the issue of the preparedness or readiness of the state, and also of the readiness of the EU. And I think that if Ukraine is accepted as a member of the EU, it will be in a very long time period, or I'm afraid. So I think it's not an short-term solution or instant solution that could be adopted in a few years, unfortunately.
So another question, which states have seized the most of Russian citizens' assets through non-state sanctions? Yes.
Yeah. Actually, the non-state sanctions do not include seizing the assets, or they can include some financial measures, and they will certainly be some financial measures that are related to the interstate sanctions, but that are not at the same time covered by them. It is because of the tendency to over-compliance in the financial sector. The freezes of the assets of the persons listed on the sanctions list are the official part of the interstate sanctions. For example, in the EU. The EU has adopted the financial sanctions, and it has targeted many people with these sanctions. But at the same time, it is possible that the banks do not enter into contracts or do not open new assets and do not offer new services to the Russian people because of the reputation and because it is now quite risky. So usually the banking houses are much more careful about the operation and about the contacts with the people from the territory which is subject to sanctions. But their measures, or these measures, this over-compliance does not include directly the freezing of assets.
So another question, a question from Alexis Martinon, I think. So in general, wouldn't punishing a country too regularly and too violently be counterproductive in the long term? Doesn't the country end up getting used to the sanctions? Wouldn't too many sanctions lead states to immunize themselves against sanctions?
Yeah, actually something like that may happen. I wouldn't say that it would be because of the immunization of the target states, but rather it is because simply the regime does not care for its people and for what is happening to the people. This was, for example, the Iraqi situation where the population suffered very severely under the international sanctions regime, but at the same time, the government did not care. So that may happen, and actually this was the reason for the sanctions reform I have mentioned around the year 2000, and for the imposition or the introduction of the so-called targeted sanctions that are directed to the representatives of the regime. And actually, this is the logic that's now a bit changing with the non-state sanctions. So maybe this might be also the problem in the long period. Maybe we will face it, or we will be witness of it in a few years. It's difficult to say.
Yes, and we can have as well the limitation of the Russian collaboration with Western countries that will limit the efficiency. Yes, but there are two questions here. Is it possible that Russia will accept price cap on Russian oil? Thank you in advance for an answer. Anthony Echo.
I think the question is if we need their acceptance. Yeah, because the price cap is actually the measure which is adopted at the European market. And at the same time, the Russian consent is not necessary to adopt it or to introduce this measure. But at the same time, the question is whether Russia will continue their deliveries of oil to the European market, and that's the question, because it's at the same time the economic question and the question of the economic performance. And of course, a very tough political question. So again, it is difficult to forecast in this case what will happen, and whether the economic card or aspect will be more important than the political one, or vice versa.
So I'm not asking anymore, but maybe a person will ask directly their question. I see that there is a question of Historia movie or Soviet. I don't know what it is. Probably it's a review or a journal. Maybe you want to ask directly the question?
Yes.
If not, yes.
When have ever sanctions worked historically? Because you said sanctions are present from antiquities.
Actually, the effectiveness of international sanctions, and now I mean these interstate sanctions or sanctions that are adopted by states and by intergovernmental organizations. So the effectiveness of these sanctions is a very extensive research agenda. And there have been many studies in the ways how sanctions actually work and whether they really result in some change of the behavior of the sanctions target. And the outcomes of these studies or of this research are not too optimistic, but at the same time, they show that the sanctions can work. There is a very extensive study that have been conducted in the late 1990s by an American team, and they followed many examples of sanctions that were adopted in the 20th century. And on these examples, they showed that the effects are different in a long period and also in the short period. So in the short period, the effects are usually milder. In the long period, the chance that the behavior of the target will change is, of course, bigger. At the same time, also the effectiveness depends on the aim of the sanctions or of the request of the sanction senders of what they really want to achieve. If they specify their requests, or if the requests are more specific and narrower, then the chance that they will be fulfilled is again higher. If the aim of the sanctions is too broad, and in particular, if we want to achieve the change of the regime in a state, then usually the sanctions do not work. So it is correlated to also to the main aim of the sanctions. In this case, I would say it is a kind of middle range requests or mid-range aim. The sanctions are not directed towards the regime as such. We do not want to overthrow it, but at the same time, we request a very substantial change in the behavior, which might limit the effect. So the question is, what is actually the desired effect? If it's just stopping the war, or if it's stopping the war plus something like complete withdrawal from Ukraine, returning Crimea back to the Ukraine, and actually the broader these requests, the lower the chance that they will be fulfilled.
Jan Solis, maybe you want to ask directly.
Would it be possible for Western countries to stop all trade with Russia?
Yeah, against maybe it's rather guessing. Yeah, difficult to say. It would be just a speculation. So maybe sorry for not answering.
I see here that there is no question anymore on the chat, so maybe I will use this moment to ask my own question. I have already a few questions. If you can hear me well. First aspect is you are speaking about non-state sanctions on the example of Ukraine, of the war on Ukraine. I suppose that if you have many countries where you have non-state sanctions, it means that you have a kind of ethical consensus. What is wrong or what is bad? Do we know how large is this consensus? Is it just limited to Western countries, or do we have some non-Western countries participating to the boycott? And second question, do we know inside of the Western countries how strong is this consensus?
I would separate the answer to two aspects. One aspect is the countries that are the members of the coalition of the sanctions senders, because actually these countries do not influence the non-state actors directly. Of course, some of them pressure of the non-state actors to withdraw from Russia. It can be a direct pressure, some recommendations through the media and so on, that was happening a few months ago, even here in the Czech Republic. So that happens. Another aspect is whether the non-state actors from non-Western countries also join the sanctions, because they can do that even if their state is not joining the coalition. The answer to the first part of the question is yes, there are some examples, and in particular, Japan is the example of a non-Western country that joined the coalition, but at the same time, it is the a highly developed country which links it to the West. If we move to the non-state actors, there are some companies, in particular bigger companies from, for example, China, that also downsize their operations in Russia. But they are doing it not that publicly as the Western ones. So while the Western companies, for example, announce it on their websites or Twitter accounts and so on, and make their withdrawal and their steps public, the companies from non-Western countries withdraw rather secretly, or not secretly, but unpublicly, so maybe tacitly. And they are doing this because of the reputational issues, because if they want to continue their operations in the Western market, having business in Russia can be a complication to it. So some of them downsize or their operations in Russia or withdraw the Russian markets because they want to continue their business in the US or in the EU. At the same time, in particular, the United States adopt what's called the secondary sanctions, which are the sanctions on the entities that somehow breach their main sanction tools. If I describe it or explain it very briefly, just so that you have the basic idea. And also the danger of these sanctions can be the motivation for the non-Western companies to withdraw the Russian market. So it is happening that the non-state actors from the non-Western world join these non-state sanctions, but they are usually not presenting their steps as sanctions, and most of them do not present them at all. Mostly they want to avoid the situation that their Russian operations will be to the detriment of their business in the West, or in the countries and in the markets that joined the sanctions, and in particular those official ones. But there are also pressures on the companies from China in particular that are operating in the Western markets, in the EU and in the UK and in the United States, so that they do so. So the public opinion in the West and also these actors who pressure try to work with these companies as well.
Thank you very much. Is there another question in the virtual room? If not, maybe I would have a second question, if you accept. My second aspect is speaking about different sanctions of different non-state actors. I noticed as an amateur, because I was not making research, that often it was based on a discourse of solidarity, a kind of humanitarian discourse, full of humanity. But these discourses of full of humanity brings two contradictions, because, for example, there was a question, should we forbid the Russian tourists to come when you have the military conscription? Should we stop any scientific cooperation with Russian intellectuals when the problem is the domination by a regime that has maybe too much influence on the population, and so on? So do you know how deals the non-public actors with these contradictions? Do we have debates? Do we have platforms of construction of this ethics? Non-state ethics?
Yeah, it has been debated in particular in the media and also in the social networks or in the social media. Actually, there were some cases that were contested or widely discussed. For example, there was the cancellation of a course in Russian literature in an Italian university, and that provoked much attention by the international media, and there was strong criticism of such a step. In this case, maybe not because of the humanitarian issues, but because of targeting the Russian culture as a whole, targeting the cultural relations as in general, which could be problematic in the future development of the mutual relations after the war is over. So this is one of the aspects. At the same time, these humanitarian issues were discussed also in the relation to the cancellations of some research cooperation between universities, for example, and actually there were pressures from other non-state actors like non-governmental organizations or some groups of non-state actors to some universities or research institutions to cancel their cooperation with Russia. But the epistemic communities contested these pressures in part because of the humanitarian reasons, because as I have mentioned during my presentation, there are many people, for example, in the Russian academia that do not support the war, but at the same time, it is dangerous to contest it or to criticize the regime openly. It is difficult to judge these people from outside. Yes, so this debate is the reality. And also there were some cases of acceptances of the Russian articles to the research journals or scientific journals, and again these steps, if the editors declared that they would not accept the articles produced by Russian researchers. So these declarations were also subject of criticism. And also some professional organizations discussed how strongly the Russian academicians will be condemned for not protesting against the war. Of course, supporting the war is another issue, but non-protesting, it's quite different. And in some organization, for example, the memberships of some institutions were terminated, or some individuals, the memberships of some individuals, members were terminated as well. But at the same time, many organizations, professional organizations, research organizations, I mean, refused to do so. So in these cases, the debates are the reality, they continue, and these are very difficult debates. And actually, there are very different perspectives, and that's the problem of ethics, that there is usually no clear good and no clear bad, but there is usually something which is a bit better and a bit worse, and you sometimes you even change from two bigger or lesser wars. So these debates are really very complicated, and I think there is no single solution to them.
Our debate as well was very complicated, and I wanted, our time is finishing, but I wanted to congratulate you to be able to present so clearly such a complicated debate, where we have to remember what are the logics of actors, and here the actors are multiple, because you have non-state actors facing state intervention. Thank you very much. I hope that I believe that everybody was enjoying this presentation a lot, because you have many questions and good questions. And I use this moment to invite you for next week. In 2 weeks, we have Bertrand Badi, professor from Paris Sciences Po, that will visit us in our geopolitical today. Thanks you in Tabor and in Czech Republic, Štěpánka, and thank you all the participants, and see you soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.